Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this week. You know, in conversations about faith and science, we tend to think about science as the examination of that which is observable or confirmable, whereas faith, we think, explores that which is unobservable, like an invisible God or what's beyond our limitations. While that stark dichotomy hasn't ever really been truly accurate, God did create all that we touch and smell and hear and observe after all. NASA has made a huge step forward in wanting to bring science into the realm of the existential. This week, NASA launched into space what's known as the Sphere X telescope. What can you tell us about it, Jim?
Well, I'm glad they shortened it to Sphere X because it stands for Spectrophotometer for the History of the Universe, Epoch of Reionization, and ICE's Explorer. So that's a mouthful. While it was delayed, they thought they were going to get it out last week. It went out actually at the time of our podcast last night, actually. It's an 8.5-foot telescope by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. And it has a singular goal to really get at the origins of the universe, unlike anything that's ever been catapulted into the universe before to study. It has the goal of answering some pretty pivotal questions, like how did the universe begin, and how did galaxies start to develop, and how did I get here? We get here as human beings. The reason this telescope hopes to do what others have not done, hopes to get at some of those questions, is because it has a very unique capability as what they call an all-sky survey with a very wide field of view. And so that means that through it, during the course of its mission, we'll be able to see the entire universe 4 times during its 2-year mission. And that means scientists are hopeful that they can draw really phenomenal conclusions from very large data set about the universe. Astronomers are in total agreement, virtual agreement about the Big Bang, that the Big Bang led to this astronomical expansion of the size of our universe in a very short amount of time. But what astronomers don't know is what triggered that expansion or why it was so extensive. And the hope is that Sphere X will somehow provide insight into how our universe began. In other words, to get into Genesis kinds of questions.
Now, while many find the launch of the telescope exciting, the prospect of what it might find alluring, some, on the other hand, feel kind of a hostile tension towards its goals, particularly in light of what the Bible has already declared about our origins. Some Christians read the creation account, as you mentioned, given in the book of Genesis, and they conclude that the Big Bang Theory is implausible. It tells us that God created the world in 6 days, after all, which would make this telescope project superfluous or perhaps even threatening. In fact, the tension between the stereotypical battle between science and faith is a big stumbling block for people who consider Christianity or might consider Christianity to be a viable worldview. So let's talk more about this. Jim, can you take us to Genesis and talk to us about the creation narrative? Could God really have created the world in 6 days?
Sure. God could have done anything he wanted to do and could have created any way he wanted to have created. The question is, did he? The real question is, did he create the universe and our world within it and all that is in and on our world in 6 24-hour solar days? If that's what Genesis teaches, then that's what Christians need to accept. The Bible is our authority. We believe it was inspired by God. It's truth without mixture of error. So the real issue is, how do we most accurately and fairly read and interpret what Genesis tells us? Does it say 6 24-hour literal days? There are 3 things to keep in mind when reading the creation narrative. And this is kind of hermeneutics 101, but still it's worth going over. Hermeneutics is a fancy word for the science of interpretation. The first is that this is a Hebrew book. Let me explain what I mean by that and why that is so significant. There are 3 ways of looking at reality, at least in Western thinking. The first is the Greek way, which is largely descriptive and largely explanatory. The Greek way of looking at the world has an emphasis on rationality. Aristotle, for example, felt that once you defined something, you were basically done. You had exhausted its essence. When you approach something with Greek questions, you tend to be searching for shape and substance and again, definition. So you might approach a car. You got a car, and you might approach it and say, well, what is a car? What does it look like? What does it feel like when I touch it? It's all description. That's the Greek way. A second way of looking at reality could be termed the Latin way, which is primarily concerned with method. A Latin question would ask, well, how does this work? How do we do this? What are the steps involved? So again, back to our car, with Latin questions, it wouldn't be what does it look like or feel like? It would be what is making this thing run? What connects the engine to the wheels? Let me lift up the hood. How does the gas create energy? Now, most of us tend to look at the world in Greek and Latin ways because if you're from the West and you're a product of the West, that's a Greek and Latin culture. I mean, that's how we were formed intellectually and every other way. So it's natural that we take our Greek and Latin questions to the Bible because that's what we're kind of oriented to ask. The problem is that you can't always use or raise Greek or Latin questions of the Bible because it's not a Greek or a Latin book. It's Hebrew, which is an entirely different way of looking at reality. I mean, it really, really is. The first 39 books of the Bible, what we call the Old Testament, were written by Hebrews in the Hebrew language from a Hebrew worldview and mindset. The 27 books that make up what we call the New Testament may have been written in Greek, Koine Greek, but that was just because it was a language of commerce. It also was written largely by Hebrew individuals with a Hebrew worldview and a Hebrew mindset, and who by themselves spoke Hebrew more naturally than they did Greek. And the Hebrew way of looking at things was very different than the Greek or the Latin way. The Hebrew mind was concerned with what a thing is for and does it work. Matters of use, utility, and value were paramount to, or is paramount to the Hebrew mind. So let's go back to our car. The Hebrew wouldn't ask what a car looked like, Greek. Wouldn't ask how it runs, Latin. It would ask, well, why would you want a car in the first place? What would you use a car for? Where would you want it to take you? Is it really going to be better than riding my camel? That's why. See, those are utility, value, use questions. That's the Hebrew mindset. That's why you can read all 4 biographies of the life of Jesus and never once find a physical description of him. 4 biographies, 4 different authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, yet he's never described physically in any of them, which is just be like mind-boggling to consider that omission if you have a Greek or a Latin mind, particularly Greek one. But to the Hebrew mind, it just wasn't important. I mean, it literally probably never entered their mind to say what he looked like. Or consider how we can read when an angel visited somebody. The question was never, what did the angel look like? You get very few descriptions of angels. I mean, you get it in Isaiah, but that's it, Isaiah 6. But that wasn't important to a Hebrew. The question was always, what does he want us to do? What did the angel want us to do? So what does this have to do with reading Genesis? Well, a lot. It's simple. We're going to want to take our Greek and Latin questions to it and almost force or expect or want Greek and Latin answers. We're not going to get them. Not unless we do violence to the text. We're not going to get them because it's a Hebrew book. So when we read something like God created the heavens and the earth, which is true, we believe it, that's what the Bible says, our first question is going to be, well, how did God create the heavens and the earth? The Greek in us wants it explained. The Latin in us wants it detailed. But Genesis doesn't tell us how God did it. Not one word. Kind of like all 4 Gospels, not a single description of Jesus. The entire creation narrative never tells us how God did it. Only that he did it. Why? It's a Hebrew book. You want Greek and Latin answers, get used to disappointment. But that's not all to keep in mind as you read the book of Genesis. You also have to remember something else. It was written in pre-scientific phenomenological language. When the author of Genesis looked at the world and Moses is traditionally seen as the author and compiler of Genesis. He not only had a Hebrew worldview, but he used, obviously, pre-scientific phenomenological language. What else did he have access to? And here's how that worked. Here's what I mean by pre-scientific phenomenological. You look out your door in the morning and you see the sun rising. So you write about the sun rising, what a beautiful sunrise it was. Later in the day, you might write about the sun setting, how the beautiful colors of the sunset, or just the time that the sun set, or the nature of the sunset. That's what I mean by phenomenological language, language rooted in what you see, in the phenomenon. And it was not just phenomenological, it was pre-scientific, meaning they did not know that what they were seeing was anything but the way things are. This now, so in their thinking, well, the sun did rise. And of course the world was flat. At the edge of the ocean, the world dropped off. Look at it. That's what your eyes tell you. You can go right now to the beach on any, and there it is, flat, and it drops off and it ends. And we still talk that way, even our trained meteorologists will tell us what time sunrise will be or when sunset will occur. The only difference is that now, even though we talk that way, we know that the sun does not rise. We know the sun does not set. So keep this in mind. Keep when we're dealing with this. This is an ancient text. Yes, those who follow Jesus believe every word of the Bible is inspired by God, but the idea of inspiration means that God worked through the authors so that they wrote and compiled exactly what he wanted them to, yet each writing of the Bible still reflects the personalities and writing style of that author and their historical and cultural settings. And that leads us to one more dynamic to keep in mind. What style or genre did our author write in? When it comes to the opening of Genesis, it's easy to spot. It was poetry, specifically a combination of prose narrative and epic poem. It wasn't trying to be a scientific text. It wasn't trying to be a treatise, nor was it trying, at least in the first few chapters, to be a detailed history. It will later become a historical narrative, to be sure, but that's not what marks the first few chapters. That's what was inspired. What we have is what was inspired. So we have to interpret it according to what the Holy Spirit actually inspired, the genre, the type, the everything. So now, with that in mind, let's move on to the days. I'll give you a very long answer, but it deserves it. So now let's move on to the days. And let's begin by defining, with the things that I just mentioned in mind, what is meant in Genesis by a day. Because how you define it makes a difference. For example, let's say you read the opening section of Genesis not as poetry, but as a precise scientific statement. You want Greek and Latin answers to your Greek and Latin questions, and by golly, you're going to get them. Which would mean that you read the word day, or that something happened in a day or on a day, and you automatically assume and put into that 24-hour solar day in modern understandings and modern precision. Then from that, you use histories and you use genealogies in the Bible and calculate that the age of the earth, if they are 6 24-hour solar days, that the age of the earth has to be around 6,000 years, at least according to the genealogies, which would mean that all of the scientific evidence, all of it, of the Big Bang happening about 14 billion years ago, and the Earth being 4.5 billion years old, is wrong. That the light we see coming from stars billions of light years away, the geological stratigraphy that we see in place in such settings as a Grand Canyon ranging from 200 million to 2 billion years ago, the age of the fossils that we find of dinosaurs, has to either all be ignored or dismissed by spending incredible amounts of energy on scientifically dubious theories that try to explain it all away in light of a supposed young Earth. Or you just write off the Bible as just clearly crazy and wrong for teaching the creation of the universe in 6 literal 24-hour days and the Earth being a mere 6,000 years old, which flies in the face of science. And you have people who do both. They read it as being 24-hour days and end up feeling they have to believe scientific crazy, or they read it thinking that people who believe the Bible are scientifically crazy. But is that the way to understand the meaning of day in Genesis? No. I would argue against that. The mention of days was just an ancient poetic way of talking about the fact that God did it in space and time. People who try to make it a scientific statement about 7 literal 24-hour solar days, making the age of the universe at around 6,000 years old, aren't, I would argue, reading the text carefully. They're not reading it in light of the genre in which it was written or in its context. How God could have wanted to inspire the writer of Genesis to convey scientific precision about literal 24-hour solar days, when according to the text, the sun and the moon were not even created until the 4th day. That just makes no sense. You didn't even have it. You're probably saying, well, I thought you Christians took the Bible literally. To which I would say, I do actually. But I would say to those readers, I don't think you're taking it literally enough. You couldn't have even had a 24-hour solar day until the 4th day, because there was nothing in existence to be solar about. I think God could have inspired the writer to be a little more careful on that one if he meant it to be a scientific statement. Clearly, this is epic, poetic, figurative language, but that's not all. Even the word used in the original Hebrew language for day in Genesis is the Hebrew word yom, which can mean a 24-hour solar day, to be sure. But it can also mean a segment of time. It can mean anywhere from weeks to a year, if you know your Hebrew. It can to several years, to an age, to even an era. We use the word day in a similar way now, talking about our grandfather's day, or days gone by, or olden days. Use of the word day, or yom, in Genesis could have stood for any period of time, even indefinite periods. It was a literary device. It wasn't a scientific declaration. So the actual days referenced poetically in Genesis were reflective of periods of time, differing geologic eras, if you will, that could have been millions of years in length, allowing for everything from the dinosaurs to the Ice Age. And let me point out that God doing it this way, creating over time, doesn't take anything away from the miraculous nature of creation. Nothing. It reminds me of an old story about an Eastern king who asked one of his counselors to give him a sign of the wonderful works of God. So the counselor told the king to plant 4 acorns. And he did. And when the king looked up after planting the 4 acorns, he saw 4 fully grown trees in front of him. Believing that only a moment had gone by, he thought that a miracle had occurred. But the counselor told the king that in truth, he had been asleep for 80 years, and 80 years had gone by. And when the king looked down and saw that he had grown old and that his clothes were now in rags, he said, well, then there is no miracle here. And the counselor said, oh, yes, there is. It is God's work, whether he did it in 80 seconds or 80 years. And that's true. Immediacy isn't the key to something miraculous. Miraculous is the key to something miraculous. Time has no real significance here.
All right, I've got a follow-up question then. Before we get to the possible implications for what you just shared, let me take a step back, because you mentioned the importance of recognizing the genre of Genesis. That said, though, many would go further and say that Genesis not only doesn't intend to speak scientifically, but also not in a way that to like realistically, or to record actual reality. In other words, many read Genesis allegorically, that there was no Adam and Eve, or a Garden of Eden, nor a Noah, nor a flood. They're all just meant to be stories that impart moral lessons. What's your response to that?
I gave a very long answer to your first question, so let me make this one short. You can't get that from the text. That's not reading it fairly either. There's nothing in the Genesis account that would suggest that it is not attempting to describe or point to something that actually happened. We may not be able to get at our Greek and our Latin questions, but the idea that God did it, that God created, that he was behind it, is without question, and that there really was a true Adam and Eve. There's nothing in the language there. There's nothing in the narrative, and even how Adam and Eve are referenced in later places throughout the Bible, and their genealogy, and they had sons and such. And so there's no doubt that there you've gone into historical narrative. So a true Adam and Eve, that at the end of whatever process there was, God breathed a soul into, true personhood. is also, again, I believe without question, based on the text. If you're going to take the text at fair value, I mean, that's what it says. And as Christians, we believe that. So nothing in what we've said would go against, nothing what I've said so far would go against a real Adam and Eve, a real Garden of Eden, a real Noah, a real flood. You can't get simple allegory from the Bible at all when it comes to the first 2 chapters of Genesis in reading or interpreting Genesis, or even the first 11 chapters of Genesis, because you don't get to know it till much later. So Adam, Eve, Noah, the flood, all real people, all events in space and time, based on, again, a fair reading of the scriptures.
Thanks for that. Okay, let's go back to the origins of the earth then. Since God doesn't share exactly how he created the world, only that he did it, could the Big Bang Theory then be a plausible way for how he did that?
Sure. But let's go back. If the first line of the first book of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," the first line of the astrophysics Bible says, "In the beginning, the Big Bang created the heavens and the earth." Some people think that's just butting heads. Well, let's talk about that. The idea of the Big Bang was first put forward by a guy named Dr. Edwin Hubble, which is the famed Hubble telescope is named after him. His theory was that at one time, all matter was packed in this dense mass at temperatures of many trillions of degrees. Then about 13.8 billion years ago, there was a huge explosion. And from that explosion, all of the matter that today forms our planets and stars was born and the universe was created. Hubble's idea was confirmed through what was then called the discovery of the century. On April 24th of 1992, the Cosmic Background Explorer satellite, better known as COBE, gave stunning confirmation of the hot Big Bang creation event. In many ways, it really was the birth and start of modern cosmology, that discovery, that affirmation. Now, where does that leave us? Is everything about the origins of the universe settled, with God pushed out completely? With that, no, it's the exact opposite, actually. Here's why. We know that something can't come from nothing. That's science 101. Something cannot come from nothing. We also know that the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. That's what the Big Bang is all about. It had a beginning. That's a bit of a problem because according to the science of the Big Bang, something did come from nothing. And that raises all kinds of questions, God-type questions. Because you can't just say that everything began with the Big Bang and act as if you somehow explain the origins of the universe, because that still doesn't explain where the matter that exploded came from. Put it in lay terms. Where did the stuff that got banged come from and who banged it? Something or someone, some way, somehow brought that first matter miraculously into existence from nothingness in such a way that it then exploded into the universe. And it had to be something outside of space and time that did it, since space and time didn't exist before the Big Bang, which science says cannot have happened by the current laws of physics, which means we're talking about something outside of the laws of physics, beyond the laws of physics, something over and above the laws of physics, something outside of all natural phenomena. There's a category for that. If it's outside of natural phenomena, it's called supernatural, which puts us in God territory. This really is something worth wrestling with intellectually. It really is. And I know we have a mixture of Christians and non-Christians who follow this podcast. So I'd really challenge folks who are wrestling with this, really think about this, because it is an intellectually significant thing to wrestle with. If the universe could not have come into being by itself from nothing, because it is a scientific impossibility that absolute nothingness could produce something or anything. It's an impossibility that absolute nothingness could produce anything. And if the universe isn't eternal, and there really was a creation event through some type of a hot Big Bang event, the questions remain. Where did the matter that exploded come from? Who or what exploded it? All of a sudden, the first line of the Bible takes on some new significance. In the beginning, God created. It's the only answer to the question of something coming out of nothing, or certainly one of the only plausible ones. George Smoot, who was head of the COBE satellite team, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics over it, noted that when the COBE satellite had measured the ripples in it was the microwave background radiation that gave confirmation to the Big Bang Theory, he said it really was like looking at God. Robert Jastrow, who's professor of astronomy at both Columbia University and Dartmouth College. He was director of the Mount Wilson Institute and manager of the Mount Wilson Observatory. For 20 years, he was director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He said, in regard to the Kobe findings and the Big Bang confirmation, he said, now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. So when people say that the Big Bang is somehow at odds with Genesis, oh my goodness, I mean, you don't even have scientists. Scientists don't even say that. They say it points back toward it. Now, I know some might say, who are skeptical, well, physics just hasn't found the answer to the something from nothing mystery yet. You can't just jump to God. Okay, fair enough. But as one of the leading physicists of our day, Alan Guth at MIT, has written, even if you could come up with a theory that would account for the creation of something from nothing through the laws of physics, you'd still have to account for the origins of the laws of physics. You don't get out from underneath this one. You just can't get out from underneath this. Excuse me. So did God use a Big Bang to create? There's no reason to say he didn't. And the very idea of a Big Bang points to what only God could have done. So again, we're not told that God did it. We're just told that he did. And so, the evidence sure does point to the Big Bang, and there's absolutely nothing that a Christian should be concerned about with it pointing toward it.
All right, that leads us to evolution then. Could there have been time within the 6 days, like however long those days may have been, for the entire evolutionary process to have occurred?
Not naturalistically. Excuse me, I got a little tickle. There we go. Yes, as mentioned, the actual days referenced poetically in Genesis were reflective of indefinite periods of time, differing geological eras that could have been millions of years in length, allowing for everything from, all kinds of things to have taken place, allowing for plenty of time for evolution to have taken place, but not naturalistically. Let's talk about evolution, because this is really interesting. A lot of people see evolution as the boogeyman and are fearful of it, but let's talk about it because it's not the boogeyman that people think it is. Again, I would say it has a lot about it that points to God. If you're a Christ follower, someone who believes in and lives by the Bible, you are by necessity a creationist. Let's go ahead and just set some ground rules here. You're a creationist. As Christians, we believe that we were wonderfully and carefully designed, that the entire creative process was miraculously and supernaturally generated by and guided by God. That's pretty much straight core Bible. But how? See, that's the question. And it's a huge cultural divide. And that cultural divide began a long time ago. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of people have heard of the Scopes trial, but they may not know much about it. It was in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. And it was a mountain town, small mountain town, Dayton was. Still is, I think. I haven't looked it up recently. What was at hand was this legal confrontation, and it really did make headlines around the world. It was a significant cultural event. You had on one side William Jennings Bryan, on the other side you had Clarence Darrow. You couldn't get two different people. The subject was the very origin of human life. It's known, again, in history as the Scopes trial. There was a young biology teacher by the name of John Scopes who was charged with violating a law that was on the Tennessee books that said you could not teach evolution in a school. Okay? He did. So as a result, the trial really did pose defenders of evolutionary theory against those who wanted public schools to teach what was considered a biblical view. William Jennings Bryan represented the state of Tennessee, the case against the evolutionary teaching teacher. And as a result, he represented those who believed in the biblical view of the creation of human beings. Clarence Darrow represented John Scopes, the teacher, and also basically represented the evolutionary theory to the world. So it really was not just the case, it was the two perspectives, two worldviews. William Jennings Bryan was a good old boy, religious Southerner. He was quintessential. Darrow, in favor of evolution and supporting Scopes, was the outspoken religious agnostic from the North, of course, polished and intellectual supplied to Scopes by the ACLU. So it was like this perfect cultural showdown, right? Most do not know that the results of the trial found the teacher guilty. Bryan won the case against Darrow. But not before Darrow, the evolutionist, had made a fool of Bryan, the creationist. William Jennings Bryan, I mean, you look back on this, you just say, you wish somebody had just stopped the guy. He agreed to allow himself to take the stand as the lawyer for the guy, the lawyer for the state, to take the stand and be cross-examined by Darrow, arguably the greatest trial lawyer of his day, on the precise accuracy of the Bible. And in the course of that cross-examination, Darrow just sliced and diced the guy. And forced Bryan to admit that he could not answer even the most basic questions about what the Bible put forward as truth. Not because there weren't answers. There were, but because Bryan wasn't exactly the sharpest biblical scholar around at all. So the verdict of history is really intriguing. Bryan won the battle, but he lost the war. And while, again, he technically won the case, the conflict stamped the entire debate with an unmistakable image. Evolution versus creation came to be seen as, culturally, the city versus the country, places like New York and Chicago against places like backwoods Dayton, Tennessee, science versus ignorance, the modern world of the 20th century versus American religious fundamentalism of the 19th century. That image has remained firmly in place ever since, really, and so have the lines of debate. Evolution has become the accepted scientific theory of how human beings and all of life developed and came into being. The biblical view of a God creating is seen as a view that is anti-scientific and out of touch with the real world. And people still, obviously, as you know, fight over this in schools to this day. But is that the caricature that we should have in mind, a divide between smart and dumb, sophisticated and backward, science and the Bible, or even between evolution and creation? It reminds me, I gotta tell the story because this is fun. Reminds me of a little boy who went to his dad and asked, "Dad, where do human beings come from?" And his father said, "Well, we descended from apes." So he goes to his mom and says, "Mom, where did human beings come from?" And she said, "Well, we were created by God in God's image." And he said, "Well, Dad said we descended from apes." And she said, "Well, I was talking about my side of the family." Here's the bottom line. The Bible tells us that God did it, that he created. It does not tell us how. It doesn't try to say that it was done over a 24-hour solar days, particularly, as I mentioned, when the sun and the moon were not even created for the fourth day. It's poetic language. So here's the real divide when it comes to any theory of creation. This is very important. It's the divide between a naturalistic view of the universe that sees nature as all that there is, and a theistic view of the universe, which remains very open to the existence and activity of a God, believes in the existence and activity of a God interacting with that universe. In other words, do you have a creative process without a God? Do you have a creative process with a God? That's the real divide. That's the real question. That's the real cultural, bumping of heads. Now, evolution is obviously the leading theory in science for the how, which, if you're a Christian and you believe the Bible, hang with me here, I would say it's fine. It's fine. If God used evolution as part of his creative process, why would I care? So be it. There's nothing in the Bible that prevents you from saying that. Because you're not saying that God didn't create. You're just saying, Bible doesn't say how. If he chose to use some aspect of evolution, some form of evolution as part of that, fine. That doesn't mean there wasn't an original Adam and Eve that God breathed an actual soul into at the end of the process to mark the beginning of the human race as we know it today. Doesn't mean, much less that you don't have a God guiding the entire process. The real question is whether something like the theory of evolution explains away God as a creative force, or by necessity pulls him in because it couldn't exist without it. See, this is where it gets really interesting to me. What you find is that the more you look at evolution in light of all that we know about science, the more the theory of evolution itself makes a strong case for the necessity of God's creative work and God's guiding involvement, the necessity of that. For example, let's think about the timeline. I mentioned that you asked if there was enough time for evolution to take place, and my answer was not naturalistically. Here's what I meant by that. While the age of the universe is around 13.8 billion years, and the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years, give or take, life didn't exist 4.5 billion years ago. It couldn't. It was a geologically violent time. There was constant bombardment from meteorites. The Earth itself had to cool. Its surface had to solidify to a crust. Life on Earth, the latest and best scientific thinking goes, began about 3.8 billion years ago in the form of single-celled prokaryotic cells, such as bacteria. Multicellular life didn't come into play until more than 1 billion years later. It's only in the last 570 million years that the kind of life forms that we're familiar with even began to evolve, starting with arthropods, followed by fish, then land plants 470 million or so years ago. Forests didn't begin until, about 385 million years ago. Mammals didn't evolve until about 200 million years ago. Our own species, Homo sapiens, the latest best thinking, goes maybe 200,000 years ago, at least in terms of DNA makeup. So humans have been around for a mere 0.004% of the Earth's history. That's the evolutionary time frame. That's also the evolutionary problem. The whole idea behind naturalistic evolution, remember I gave those two, naturalistic versus theistic. Naturalistic evolution is that it's a product of time plus chance. That's all it is. Time plus chance. That's not enough time. It's not enough time. It's not enough time for the Earth to cool and life to be produced naturalistically by chance. One-time Plumian professor of astrophysics at Cambridge University, Sir Frederick Hoyle, has determined that if you would compute the time required to get all 200,000 amino acids for one human cell, to come together by chance, it would be almost 293 times the estimated age of the Earth. 293 times the age of the Earth for that to have come about by chance. One cell, one human cell. For the timeline to work, it would be like having the working dynamics of the latest iPhone, along with the entire corporate campus of Apple that produced it, be instantly created by chance through a single explosion in a computer geek's garage. So if you're going to embrace the theory of evolution, you would almost by necessity need to embrace some kind of outside, guiding, enhancing force that sped it along, guided it strategically within the time frame of the age of the Earth. Naturalistically, it couldn't have happened. But even if there was enough time, let's just play this out. Let's just say there was enough time. Or perhaps you want to buy into mutations and evolutionary leaps filling in all of the time gaps. You have the problem of the initial complexity of life. And this is what molecular biology has thrown into the mix of late. Darwin himself said that if it could ever be demonstrated, ever, that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, he said my theory would absolutely break down. Biochemist Michael Behe speaks of Darwin's self-challenge in terms of a mousetrap. And it's kind of interesting. He says, he talks about how the common mousetrap only has a few parts. You have the platform, you have a hammer, you have a catch, you have a spring, you have a holding bar. Each component is required for the mousetrap to function as a mousetrap. You can't start off with just a wooden base and have a mouse just kind of come up to it and just die. You don't just start catching a few mice with just a platform, a piece of wood, and then add a bar and catch a few more and functionally evolve into the current design step by Darwinian step, getting more effective at catching mice into the most effective mousetrap, which has a base, hammer, spring, catch, and holding bar. No, in order to even begin functioning as a mousetrap, there has to be a minimum number of interacting parts that are assembled that allow the catching of mice to begin developing into more advanced levels of catching of mice. Take away any of the 5 parts and ain't any mice being caught. The conclusion is that the mousetrap was somehow made from the beginning as an intact system. It could not have just evolved into that system. It had to have been designed as a system for that purpose. And this is what you find with molecular biology. The basic forms of life are not simple, but irreducibly complex molecular machines that cannot be explained by natural selection working on variation. Think about something like the human eye. According to evolutionary theory, it would have started out with a simple light-sensitive spot and then evolved that light-sensitive spot, evolved into what we see with today, the human eye. The problem is that when we finally got to the point where we were able to study life at the molecular level and look at things like that light-sensitive spot, we found it wasn't simple. We found that it was irreducibly complex, which means something or someone had to create that first complex system from which it began to evolve. You might be able to start simple and get to complex, which is what evolutionary theory maintains, but you can't start complex, which is what we're finding out had to have happened. But that's not all there is to think about. How did a purely naturalistic process create ever increasing diversity? In other words, the idea of macroevolution, which is one species evolving into a totally different species. This is very different than microevolution, which nobody has any problem with, which is just changes or adaptation within a species. Microevolution is like a dog breeder, breeding a dog that sheds less hair, but it's still a dog. What they can't do is breed a dog that flies. But that's what naturalistic evolutionary theory says happened, that microevolution somehow led to macroevolution. That single-celled bacteria led to multi-cell bacteria. Multi-cell bacteria led to spiders. Spiders somehow led to fish. Fish somehow led to plants, and plants somehow led to mammals, and it somehow all eventually led to us. When it comes to the science of that, there's just not much. How one species creates a completely different species is at best a little vague. But here's the biggest challenge of all: the beginning of life itself. You can't just say life exists because 3.9 or 3.8 billion years ago it began evolving from single-celled prokaryotic cells. Evolutionary theorists have to ask, how did those first bacteria come to life? It's a profound question. How did life come from non-life? You can say that within chemically rich liquid oceans, organic molecules transition to self-replicating life, but that's like saying your SUV became Optimus Prime because it went through a car wash. That doesn't answer anything. It doesn't just happen. So what is the leading theory of how this is all solved outside of a God working in and through it? Because it's not like evolutionary biologists are fools. It's not that they're unaware of these challenges. They are. This might surprise you, but one of the leading ideas is called panspermia. The idea that the first life, along with the beginning complexity, which you needed, you got to have that first life, got to have complexity, was seeded here from another planet, such as Mars. But you know what that solves? Nothing. If all the scientific challenges around life beginning on its own on Earth attempts to be solved by saying that life began somewhere else and got here on the back of a meteorite, how did that life start there? You have the same set of questions about how life could come from non-life and how you could begin with complexity. It solves nothing. So again, the issue really is not a battle between the Bible and science. It's not between creation and evolution. The Bible doesn't say how God did it. It very well could have been through some use of evolution and other things, just God just doing whatever he wanted to do. The real decision is between theism and naturalism. And the more you look at evolution, the more it seems like you sure do need a God for it to have been pulled off. And that's what Genesis tells us.
This has been so good, but I have one eye on the clock and another eye on the list of questions that I still haven't gotten to, which I'm not going to give up on because I want to talk about Adam and Eve, I want to talk about dinosaurs, I want to talk about the flood, and more. So let's do this. Are you okay if we put a pin in the conversation now, and then we can pick this up next week so that I don't have to go without answers to the rest of my questions? Does that sound okay? Awesome. Jim's giving me a thumbs up in case you're not watching on YouTube. But yes. Okay, so let's do that. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll tell someone about it. I hope you'll send it to them, or better yet, invite them to join next week and listen to it when it comes out. In the meantime, I'm sure there will be plenty of resources in the show notes to keep you occupied in case you want to dig deeper. But again, thank you for your time today. Thank you, Jim, and we'll catch you guys next week.